The unfolding confrontation. The morning at Arlington National Cemetery was steeped in solemnity. Gray clouds hung low, casting a heavy shroud over the ceremony. The scent of freshly cut grass mixed with the metallic tang of polished metals pinned to the uniforms of gathered soldiers, forming an atmosphere both dignified and weighty. Standing at the podium, General Rascal Payne adjusted the microphone. She was no stranger to delivering ceremonial speeches, but today felt different. Before her, hundreds stood with bowed heads, faces etched with the grief of loss. At the center of them all, the flag-draped casket of Colonel Jace Pond rested in silence, the final emblem of his sacrifice for his country. As one of the highest-ranking Black women in the military, General Payne had overcome countless obstacles. She had commanded in the harshest battle zones, shattered barriers, and led her troops with unyielding resilience. Yet, even at this pinnacle of service, she knew there were still those who would never accept her presence. She drew in a deep breath before beginning her speech. Her voice was strong and resolute. Colonel Jace Pond was more than a soldier. He was a leader, a friend, a man who always placed his comrades above himself. Today we bid him farewell, but we will never forget. A subtle commotion in the crowd made her pause briefly. Years of honed military instinct sent a warning through her gut. She let her gaze flicker over the mourners, but nothing seemed out of place. A gentle breeze stirred the flag covering the casket. She continued, "Men like Jace did not fight for glory, but because they believed in the ideals this military upholds. They walked onto battlefields, not for themselves, but for the belief that every person." A sharp, deliberate set of footsteps cut through the silence. A man shoved past the mourners, his movements forceful yet controlled. He was not in uniform. A long black coat draped over his broad frame, concealing his form, but his tense face betrayed his simmering fury. Nearby soldiers tensed, hands instinctively resting on their holstered weapons. The energy in the air shifted, charged with something raw and unpredictable. General Payne did not move. She remained upright, her gaze firm, already assessing the unfolding threat. The man stopped a few meters from the podium, his eyes locked onto hers with seething resentment. Then, in a voice low but laced with menace, he spoke. "You don't belong here." His words sliced through the quiet like a blade. A murmur rippled through the gathered crowd. Eyes darted between the stranger and the general, uncertainty mingling with shock. Several senior officers stepped forward, their bodies angled in quiet readiness, not yet drawing weapons, but poised for escalation. General Payne's expression did not waver. She met the man's glare with an unshaken resolve. Then she spoke, slowly, with deliberate authority. "And who exactly do you believe belongs here?" The tension thickened like an unbroken storm. Sergeant Will, the man who had interrupted, clenched his fists inside his coat pockets, his jaw tightening as though barely containing something volatile. No one knew what would happen next. But one thing was certain. This would be no ordinary funeral. The weight of silence. A heavy silence blanketed Arlington National Cemetery like a thick fog. Sergeant Will's words had ripped through the solemnity of the funeral, leaving an uneasy tension in their wake. All eyes turned toward him, yet he stared only at General Rascal Payne, his gaze burning with barely restrained fury. The officers standing nearby immediately recognized the danger. They took a cautious step forward, hands resting lightly on their holstered weapons, their eyes sharp with vigilance. Some mourners whispered among themselves, while others instinctively stepped back, pressing against the headstones as though seeking refuge from the palpable tension. But General Payne remained unmoved. She stood firm, her gaze locked onto Will's. Years on the battlefield had trained her to handle men like him, men who believed their power could intimidate, that their hatred could instill fear. She took a measured step forward, her voice calm yet commanding. "What did you just say?" Will clenched his fists inside his coat pockets, his entire body rigid, coiled like a spring ready to snap. He glanced around, seeing the eyes upon him, some filled with judgment, others with apprehension. His jaw tightened before he forced a twisted smirk onto his face. "I said, you don't belong here." This time his voice was louder, clearer, sharper. A wave of murmurs spread through the crowd. Those closest to the podium exchanged uneasy glances, and a few soldiers visibly tensed. But no one interrupted. No one dared to break the unfolding standoff. General Payne did not flinch. She held his gaze, studying him, not with fear, but with a piercing clarity that seemed to strip away every layer he had wrapped around himself. And then she spoke, her words deliberate, each syllable cutting through the tension like a blade. "And who exactly does belong here?" A silence so profound followed that it seemed to swallow the very air around them. Will froze. He hadn't expected that. He had expected anger, expected her to lash out, expected some kind of loss of control. But she didn't. She simply stood there, unwavering, waiting. His mouth opened as if to respond, but then closed again. Because deep down he had no answer. His words had not been an argument. They had been a release of frustration, the outburst of a man who felt the world shifting in ways he couldn't understand, couldn't accept. He didn't know how to react to someone like General Payne, someone who stood her ground, undeterred, unshaken by the weight of judgment. And at that moment, he realized something. He had lost control, not over her, not over the soldiers who stood ready to intervene, but over himself. His breath quickened. His gaze flickered with uncertainty. General Payne saw it. She said nothing more. She didn't need to. She had already won, not through force, not through intimidation, but through sheer, unwavering resolve. Will's fists clenched one last time before he turned on his heel and walked away. No one stopped him. He had already lost, to himself, the moment of truth. A heavy silence blanketed the cemetery. No one moved. No one breathed. Time itself seemed to freeze as Will drew his gun, pointing it directly at General Rascal Payne. A cold gust of wind swept through the rows of headstones, rustling the funeral wreaths, but no one paid it any mind. Every eye was locked onto Will, onto the weapon in his hands, and onto the woman standing before him, completely unfazed. "Lower your weapon." Colonel Whitmore's voice cut through the tension, firm, commanding. Several officers had already reached for their sidearms, but no one acted rashly. They knew the wrong move, a step too sudden, could make Will pull the trigger. But General Payne was different. She didn't hesitate. She didn't fear the situation the way they did. She simply held Will's gaze unwavering. "What are you doing?" Her voice was calm, but there was something in her eyes that made Will freeze. He didn't know how to answer. He had never thought this far ahead. He had never truly envisioned this moment, standing before the woman he despised, with all the power in his grasp. And yet, now that he had it, it felt hollow. His teeth clenched, his eyes burned. "You don't belong here," he snarled. General Payne tilted her head slightly and took a step forward. Will flinched. His grip on the gun trembled ever so slightly. "And who decides that?" Her words were sharp as a blade, slicing through the suffocating tension. Will blinked. He had expected her to plead. He had expected her to panic. He had expected her to look at him with submission. But she didn't. She looked at him as if he were nothing more than a child throwing a tantrum, not a threat, not a force to be reckoned with. And that enraged him more than anything. His fingers tightened. "You don't deserve that uniform," he spat. "You don't deserve your rank." But this time he heard it, the weakness in his own voice. He heard the uncertainty, the hesitation, the doubt. And so did General Payne. She stepped forward again. Now only a few feet separated them. "And you?" Will blinked. "What have you done to deserve your place?" He had no answer. He had expected control. He had expected to force her to kneel before him. But now he was the one backing away. His mind spun. Images, thoughts, memories. Things he had buried, things he didn't want to confront, flooded his head. He felt as though he were falling into an abyss. His hand trembled. His fingers slipped from the trigger. The air in the cemetery grew thick. The surrounding officers held their breath. And then, Will slowly lowered the gun. The silence shattered. Captain Ruiz rushed forward, seizing the weapon and forcing Will to the ground. The sharp click of handcuffs echoed, cold, final. But General Payne wasn't looking at him anymore. She had already won, not with force, not with orders. She had won because Will had finally seen the brutal truth. He had never truly held power, and that realization destroyed him, shattered in an instant. The gunshot tore through the suffocating air of the funeral. A single bullet soared into the sky, leaving behind a deafening silence that gripped the cemetery. General Rascal Payne remained standing, unwavering. The honor guard froze in place, rifles still raised, but no one fired. Military officers reacted immediately, hands moving instinctively to their holsters, ready to act. Will was pinned to the ground, thrashing like a rabid animal trapped in a cage. "Let me go! He doesn't belong here! He's not one of us!" His voice was raw, frenzied, veins bulging as his bloodshot eyes darted wildly. But no one was listening anymore. This was no longer his fight. This was the moment he had already lost. Captain Ruiz pressed a knee firmly into Will's back, wrenching his arms behind him, locking the steel cuffs around his wrists with force. Some mourners were still crouched behind gravestones, shielding their loved ones. Others were slowly rising to their feet, glancing at one another with expressions of shock and disbelief. But General Payne hadn't moved. He simply stared at Will, his gaze sharp as a steel blade. A break in the heavy gray clouds allowed a sliver of sunlight to pierce through, reflecting off the metals on his crisp blue uniform, casting a faint shimmer across the somber landscape. "You said I don't belong here." His voice rang clear, steady, cutting through the whispers of fear lingering in the air. Will lifted his head, his face flushed, breath coming in ragged gasps. He clenched his teeth, shaking his head violently. "Not you! Not you! You took everything from us." Rascal continued watching him, unwavering. "What did I take from you?" Will stopped struggling. He had no answer. Sweat trickled down his temple. His fingers clenched so tightly that his knuckles turned white. Because the only answer he had was his own fear. He didn't fear Rascal Payne. He feared the truth, that someone like Rascal could stand where he stood, while he could not. The officers around them had begun to understand. The young soldiers in the honor guard were starting to realize what had just unfolded. This wasn't just an attack. It was a desperate act by a man who couldn't accept that the world had changed. But the world did not stop for a man's fear. Rascal met Will's gaze, his voice calm, yet weighted with finality. "You have failed." The cemetery held its breath. No more struggling, no more shouting. Only the cold snap of handcuffs tightening as officers hoisted Will to his feet and dragged him away. His eyes remained locked onto Rascal, but this time there was no hatred in them, only defeat. Rascal took a deep breath, then turned back to the honor guard. "Proceed." His command was firm, without hesitation. 3 volleys of rifle fire cracked through the sky, restoring the solemn dignity of the ceremony. This time, nothing stood in their way. The gray sky over Arlington. The sky above Arlington remained a somber gray, but silence no longer blanketed the cemetery. The news of what had transpired at Jace Pond's funeral had spread like wildfire, igniting an unprecedented national debate. Every media outlet broadcasted the tense moment when Sergeant Will, a police officer, pointed his gun at General Rascal Payne, a decorated military leader. No one could forget that moment. This was more than just an attack. It had become a symbol of a deeper issue, one that America could no longer ignore. The media storm. The news spread at an unstoppable pace. A cop tried to assassinate a general. At Arlington, the nation erupted. Talk shows, social media platforms, and press conferences flooded the airwaves. Everyone wanted answers. Who was Will? What had driven him to such an act? Was this an isolated incident, or was it a symptom of a much larger problem within law enforcement? Piece by piece, the story unraveled. Will was not an unknown figure. He had a long history of excessive force complaints, but not once had he been held accountable. He had always managed to slip through internal investigations, always had someone covering for him, but this time there was no escape. The public's response veteran organizations spoke out. Military leaders demanded a transparent investigation. Civil rights groups called for police reform. Even politicians were drawn into the storm. A new bill was introduced in Congress, proposing stricter oversight of officers with a history of disciplinary violations. Law enforcement agencies across the country were forced to reevaluate how they handled officers like Will. "We cannot allow people like him to hold power." A quote from a veteran went viral across social media. But amid the chaos, Rascal Payne remained silent. General Rascal Payne, the man who didn't need to speak. He did not give interviews. He did not post statements online. He did not appear on television to discuss the incident because he didn't need to. The image of him in that defining moment, standing firm, unblinking, with a gun pointed at his chest, said everything. "Was he not afraid?" a reporter asked one of his officers. The officer merely smirked. "He has stood in the middle of enemy fire on the battlefield. You think he would be afraid of someone like Will?" His silence was not avoidance. It was a statement. The truth did not need to be shouted. It asserted itself. An ending or a beginning? A week after the incident, Will was arrested and charged with multiple crimes. His trial became a landmark case in American legal history, a turning point in how society viewed accountability in law enforcement. But this was not just a story about a rogue cop. This was the story of a nation confronting the shadows within its own system. And Rascal Payne, through his unwavering resolve and silence, had become the symbol of change. The storm over Arlington. The sky over Arlington remained heavy with gray clouds, but the real storm was now sweeping across the entire nation. The events at Jace Pond's funeral were no longer just an isolated incident. They had become a symbol of a much deeper crisis. One man's action, an entire system's consequences. The image of Sergeant Will, a police officer, pointing a gun at General Rascal Payne, had shaken the United States to its core. The video of that moment was replayed on every news channel, flooded social media, and even sparked debates in Congress. A single question echoed everywhere. How could a police officer so brazenly aim a gun at a general during a funeral? The investigation into Will began immediately, and the truth unraveled faster than anyone expected. Will was not an unknown officer. His record was filled with complaints of violence, discrimination, and abuse of power, yet not once had he faced real consequences. Until now, his actions were no longer just personal misconduct. They became the embodiment of a much larger conflict, a system that had long abused its authority versus a military institution that upheld honor. Rascal Payne, a symbol of unshaken resolve. While the outside world spiraled into chaos, General Rascal Payne remained eerily composed. No interviews, no social media statements, no complaints, because he didn't need to say anything. The moment he stood tall, unwavering, staring straight into Will's eyes without an ounce of fear, that moment said everything. His calmness was not defiance. It was proof of an undeniable truth. Real power doesn't come from a gun. It comes from honor, responsibility, and courage. The legal battle and public reckoning. Following the incident, Will was arrested and brought to trial. The prosecution didn't have to work hard. The video alone was damning evidence. Witnesses, including military officers and civilians, all testified to the same conclusion. Will was not just guilty of assault. He represented a system that had enabled abuse of power for far too long. The public's outrage was immediate and widespread. Veteran organizations demanded justice. Civil rights groups called for police reform. Congress held emergency hearings on law enforcement accountability. We cannot let people like him represent justice. A senator's words during the hearings went viral, shared millions of times across social media. A landmark verdict. On the day of sentencing, the courtroom was packed. For the first time in his life, Will felt powerless. No badge, no gun, no system to shield him. The judge delivered the ruling: life in prison, no parole. A wave of relief rippled through the courtroom, not because of satisfaction in his punishment, but because justice had finally prevailed. A new beginning. Will's case did not just end with his conviction. It marked the beginning of a new era for America. New policies were enacted. Law enforcement reforms spread from federal to local levels. Officers with disciplinary records were scrutinized more than ever before. More importantly, this case sent a message that resonated across the nation. Power cannot stand above the law. And at the center of this transformation stood General Rascal Payne, a man whose unwavering stance in the face of crisis had become the symbol of a nation's reckoning and change. Justice does not end in a courtroom. When the trial concluded, Will was sentenced to life in prison without parole, but the story did not end there. What happened at Jace Pond's funeral had transcended a single case. It became the focal point of a national conversation, not just about justice for General Rascal Payne or those present that day, but about the change of an entire system, General Rascal Payne, and the silence that spoke volumes. After the trial, media outlets, political organizations, and activists all sought to have General Rascal Payne speak out, but he remained as he had been from the start. No press conferences, no fiery speeches, no harsh public statements, because he didn't need to. The image of him standing tall at the funeral, unwavering in the face of a gun pointed at him, had already become a symbol more powerful than any speech. But he did not remain silent forever. 2 weeks after the trial, he stood before hundreds of cadets at West Point, one of the most prestigious military academies in the United States. His speech was not about himself. It was not about the case. It was about responsibility. Power is not in a gun. It is not in a badge. It is in the responsibility you have to those around you. The hall fell completely silent. What happened at Arlington was not an isolated incident. It was the consequence of what we have allowed to persist for too long, and if we do not take responsibility now, it will happen again. His words were not just for the cadets in the room. They were for an entire system, for those who had ignored the warning signs, for institutions that had enabled abuse of power, for those who had taken justice for granted, and now they could no longer look away. The storm that followed. Immediately after General Payne's speech, a wave of reforms began taking shape. A bipartisan bill was introduced, requiring stricter oversight of police officers with a history of misconduct. Veteran organizations spoke out, demanding better protection for those who served, ensuring they would never be treated as General Payne had been. Internal investigations into police departments across the country began, leading to suspensions and dismissals of officers with records similar to Will's. No one could ignore it anymore. A moment never forgotten. At a community event months later, a young woman approached General Payne. She held an old photograph in her hands, trembling as she handed it to him. "My father was a soldier," she said, tears welling in her eyes. "He always believed in honor and justice. When I saw how you stood that day, I knew my father would be proud." General Payne did not say a word. He simply nodded, taking the photograph with both hands, holding it as if it were a medal of honor. A nation transformed. The events at Arlington did not just change General Payne's life. They changed an entire system. They proved that justice is not just an abstract concept, it is a responsibility. And this time, America chose to stand on the side of justice. The aftershocks of the trial. When Will's sentence was handed down, some believed the story had ended, but in reality, it was just beginning. A sweeping investigation into Will's law enforcement department revealed a disturbing pattern. Dozens of officers had records of misconduct, hidden under layers of bureaucratic protection. Some officers were suspended, others were terminated. Some even faced criminal charges. But most importantly, the culture that enabled injustice had been exposed. No one could call this an isolated incident anymore, and the public refused to stay silent. General Rascal Payne and the speech that changed everything. At a major military leadership summit, where high-ranking officials from both the military and law enforcement agencies gathered, General Rascal Payne was invited to speak. Many expected a diplomatic address, a calculated reassurance. Instead, he did the opposite. "We always speak of honor, sacrifice, and protecting this nation. But if we cannot protect justice within our own country, then what do any of those words mean?" The room fell silent. "I am not here to point fingers. I am here to say that we can do better. Because if we don't, one day it will be our own children staring down the barrel of a gun in the country we swore to defend." A story without an ending. After his speech, several officers resigned from their positions. New policies were implemented in law enforcement agencies, focusing on stricter oversight. Police academies revised their training programs, placing greater emphasis on ethics and accountability. Not everyone agreed. Not everyone changed overnight. But a conversation had started, and this time, no one could shut it down. A moment of change. Months later, at a veterans recognition event, a young 12-year-old boy approached General Payne. His eyes sparkled with admiration. "Were you afraid?" the boy asked, his voice small but steady. General Payne knelt slightly to meet his gaze. "Afraid of what?" The boy swallowed before answering. "Afraid to stand up." A long pause. Then General Payne smiled. "Everyone is afraid," he said, "but what matters is standing up, even when you are." The boy nodded as if sealing those words into his soul. As he turned to walk away, General Payne knew the real battle was never in a courtroom. It was never on a battlefield. It was in the choices each new generation made. Today, he had helped one person choose the right path. Tomorrow, there would be more. a lesson that echoes beyond time. This story leaves behind a powerful message about responsibility, justice, and courage. It reminds us that power does not create justice. The way people use power determines whether justice exists. When individuals abuse authority to sow injustice and no one stands against it, the cycle continues. But when even one person dares to face the truth, to raise their voice, to fight for what is right, change begins. Justice cannot be hidden forever. And a society is only truly strong when it has people willing to defend what is fair and right, even when it is difficult. Only by holding on to our principles, our ethics, and our responsibility can we build a world where no one has to bow before injustice. Thank you for watching. If you found this video interesting or enjoyable, please show your support by giving it a thumbs up. It really helps the channel grow and reach more amazing viewers like you. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you never miss out on our future uploads. Your support means the world to us and keeps us motivated to create even better content for you.